Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with volume 22 of our Haydn Symphony Crusade. We're getting closer to the promised land, Crusaders. Yes, number 22, one of the first symphonies of Haydn that actually has a nickname. The nickname is the Philosopher. And as usual in these cases, the nickname was not given by Haydn, although the last bunch that had nicknames, Morning, Noon, and Night, seemed to have been given by Haydn, I think, more or less. This is a symphony that we actually know when it was composed. It was written in 1764. The autograph still exists, and it is such an amazing work. There really is nothing like it written in the entire 18th century. Of course, I say all these symphonies are amazing and unique and fabulous and terrific, and they are. We have to take that for granted. But some of them have really outrageously distinctive features, and this is one of them. The outrageously distinctive feature is the fact that instead of two oboes in the orchestra, Haydn uses two English horns, which are kind of like oboes, only they're a little bit lower in pitch, a little bit more nasal, somewhat more nostalgic in tone, some people say. They're lovely instruments, they really are. And Haydn had a pair of English horns about this time, and a couple times when he was at Esterházy, and he used them. And most other composers did not have them for whatever reason, or didn't write for them as often, or they wrote for them, we don't care who they were. So Haydn's works with English horn are special, and this is his only symphony to use a pair of English horns instead of the oboes. And it colors the entire work. And it may, in some respects, account for the fact that it's such an extraordinary piece of music. This symphony has 4 movements. It begins with a slow movement. It's in what they call church sonata form. So the order of the movements is slow, fast, minuet, fast. And, there are quite a few. We've already talked about a couple Haydn symphonies that have a similar shape. And in his early symphonies, works in church sonata form are some of his most remarkable. They really are, because they show him experimenting with form and expression. It's the same thing. And the title of this symphony, The Philosopher, really does actually have something to do with the music. And the best way to get at that, I think, is to begin with a piece of music that has absolutely nothing to do with Haydn. And I don't think it really, probably it's the least, it's got to be. You'd never think about it in connection with Haydn. But here is a sample of Charles Ives' The Unanswered Question. All right, most of us who know Ives know what that sounds like, right? It's a fascinating piece. No one has any issue with that being a transcendental or philosophical piece. Why? Well, first of all, you have these offstage strings that play this mysterious background that goes on and on without any kind of concern as to what's happening in the foreground. And in the foreground, as you heard, you have a trumpet that asks the question. And then you have a quartet of woodwinds, which can be anything from 4 flutes to some mixture of things. Ives doesn't care. And they attempt in vain to answer the question until the only thing that's left at the end is the question, hanging out into nothingness as the strings go on and on and on. The fact that this is dealing with transcendental issues could not be more obvious. It's the name of the piece, The Unanswered Question. So we know that there's a question and answer and stuff going on. Well, believe it or not, Haydn's Philosopher Symphony from 1764, the first movement, does exactly the same thing that Ives would later do several hundred years later in The Unanswered Question. But of course, it does it in the language of the classical symphony. How does Haydn do it? Well, first of all, you have the string background, just like Ives does. But in this case, it's the lower strings who play a steady rhythm, staccato and piano. Just a ticking clock rhythm. Junk, 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 just like that, for the whole movement, basically. And then on top of that, you have the horns, fortissimo. And we can't wrap our brains around how unusual that is to have these bi-level dynamics. Composers in Haydn's day, they used what they call general dynamics. They would just write piano and everybody played piano. Forte, everybody played forte, but not here. Haydn breaks up the orchestra. He's starting to use his orchestral sections individually. So those lower strings are quiet and they have their own articulation and rhythm. And on top of that, the horns blast out a question, fortissimo, and they are answered by the two English horns. So it's question and answer, question and answer. And actually, the theme that the English horns play, that ya da da dum bum bum, is very similar to the opening of Schubert's Ninth Symphony as well. Though I don't know if Schubert knew Haydn's Philosopher Symphony, but it's an interesting resemblance. The point is that you have question and answer, call and response against that steady background of strings. It's exactly what Ives does in the unanswered question. Of course, it's not atonal. It's not deliberately trying to be as fuzzy, as freewheeling as Ives is, but in its way, it really is as freewheeling. It is as new and fresh and accurate expressively as the Ives. And for that reason, the idea of question and answer, of dealing with issues of time and transcendence and things like that, you can hear that in this music if you feel so inclined and interpret it that way. And that's what makes this symphony so remarkable. Now, Haydn, as I've always said, conceives of his symphonies absolutely complete, as unified wholes. All four movements fit together somehow. And aside from the fact, he has a very easy way to do it. The easiest possible way is the fact that this is the only symphony he wrote, or anyone else for that matter, that uses a pair of English horns. And you hear them in every single movement, and therefore, this is the symphony with the English horns, and it is therefore a unified organism, just through that tone color alone. But there's more to it than that, because having explored the idea of question and answer in the first movement, that becomes a topic, a theme that is realized in a different way in each of the subsequent movements. Not necessarily in a philosophical or abstract sense. In the finale, as you'll hear, it's going to be very concrete. But let's listen now to bits of each movement, and we'll hear how Haydn explores this idea of question and answer in each of them. Let's start with the first movement, which I've already basically described to you, and you'll hear very, very clearly question and answer. And it's just one of the most remarkable things he ever wrote in its technical aspect and expressively. No one had ever done something that was an attempt at that kind of metaphysical, shall we say, program that you hear in this particular movement, and which I think, listening to the Ives, kind of crystallizes in a very concrete way, doesn't it? Because you really can think of them as an identity in comparison with each other. So let's start at the beginning. The Philosopher. That was the first half. And you can go on and listen to the rest of it, because the fact is we don't have to talk about like sonata form stuff and all that. I mean, we can, because as always with Haydn, his use of these forms is fascinating. But this is one of those symphonies where the form is bent in order to express sort of a wider issue or wider concept. And it is that concept of question and answer. And having established that in the first movement, we will hear how the second movement, which is a presto, it's very, very quick, does the same thing. Although here, the various sections of the orchestra trade motives in the sense of doing a very quick, mind you, question and answer thing. So it starts with the strings, followed by the horns answer, and then toward the end of the exposition, you have the strings versus the English horns. Each section of this deals with that basic concept, that trade-off of motives, of questions and answers, of phrases traded back and forth in a different way. But we are so ingrained after hearing that first movement by the concept that we're ready to embrace all the different ways that Haydn does it as the symphony continues. So now let's listen to the exposition of the second movement. And just, again, don't worry about what the form is. Just listen to the dialogue between the various orchestral sections. One of the things that's so remarkable about this music is how much variety and color Haydn gets out of this tiny, tiny orchestra. I mean, it's two English horns, two regular horns, French horns, and strings. There's a bassoon possibly on the bottom, but there's no part written for it. It just plays along with the bass line. And there's a harpsichord continuo, which I also didn't write, and which is completely unnecessary, but most performances include. But that's all it is. But the amazing thing is how wonderfully colorful and how characterful the exchanges are between these tiny little orchestral sections. Now, the minuet we're not going to play bits of, but it too encapsulates this type of question and answer or alternation in the largest possible way, because the entire minuet uses the full orchestra. That is basically the strings colored by the horns and English horns, but it's a string texture. But the trio section, the middle section, reverses that and has the oboes and English horns, the English horns and French horns as the solo instruments throughout, accompanied lightly by the strings. Now, we've heard many Haydn minuets, which have the basic string texture in the minuet and the trio section given over to the wind section, just to create a contrast, and it's simply a contrast of color. But in this particular symphony, that basic habit, that regular habit, that typical characteristic of Haydn's style acquires an extra meaning because of the way that the symphony has been evolving up to that point. And so when we get to the finale is the opposite of the first movement, in a sense of, if the first movement is about some sort of metaphysical question and answer, something in the abstract, this finale is as concrete as can be, because it's a hunting piece. It's a hunting piece in 6/8 with hunting horns, and a hunt is a chase, right? I mean, it's a chase. It's not a question and an answer, but it's a pursuit. So the opening of this finale starts out with the strings, with the horns sort of in the background, and then the horns break out and the woodwinds answer, and we're off to the hunt. And that too is an element of the question and answer opening of the first movement, but in a completely concrete, programmatic, down to earth, nothing mysterious about it. It's a hunt. And so you have the different parts chasing after each other. which is the concrete embodiment of that question and answer idea, the chase, one part following another part, with each given the opportunity to express itself in its own virtuosity and color. And I'm going to play you the entire finale without repeats, and here it is. Delicious, lots of fun. Haydn wrote a lot of music that evoked the hunt. It was one of the great tropes of his day. It was one of the ways to sort of flatter your aristocratic patron, who was supposed to be, a warrior or a soldier and a hunter, and so you wrote hunting music, and you use actual horn calls, and we're going to hear a bunch of those things in Haydn's symphonies. But this one, again, it's not just your everyday hunt, because we hear it in the context of a general idea or program of question, answer, call, and response. And we hear it in all the different contexts in which Haydn feels he can present it musically in the four movements of a symphony. And that's what makes these symphonies so all-encompassing. Mahler's great line was that the symphony must be the world. It should embrace everything. And that's what Haydn does in these symphonies in his own way. In only 17 and a bit minutes, he's taking all of the different ways in which this question and answer, call and response formula can be used to express different things, from the very concrete and vivid imagery of the hunt to something much, much more abstract and possibly metaphysical, we don't know for sure, to a dance. It's just extraordinary. And this symphony really rightly has earned its nickname and has earned a certain amount of fame, even among those who don't really care about Haydn symphonies, who only listen to the late ones. This first one is really famous, and for that good reason. Also, what's very interesting is that this symphony actually exists in another version, because two English horns was not something that was going to be sort of commonplace in Haydn's day. So when the symphony was later published, which he had nothing to do with the publication, especially, he rewrote it. He rewrote it and substituted flute parts for the English horn parts, and he composed a separate slow movement. So the actual symphony has the second movement that exists today and the finale that exists today, and a different slow movement in the middle. And that version is, generally speaking, never performed as a legitimate version of this symphony. The first movement was gone, and really he Baudelarized the whole thing, but he reused it to make a symphony, basically just to make a symphony that became quite popular apparently in this other form. But it stripped away all of the things that make the original version so magnificent and so interesting. But it does tell us something about how practical he was, and what composers had to do in those days in order to adapt themselves to local conditions. We're very lucky that Haydn had special conditions, working at Esterhazy, where he could do basically whatever he pleased, and a very, very sophisticated, apparently very sophisticated audience that he was writing for that understood what he was doing and allowed him to experiment and stretch the bounds of what music, as it was thought of in those days, stretch the bounds of what those things can do. And in doing so, he reaches all the way forward to Charles Ives and the unanswered question. I think that is just such a cool correspondence, and I hope you do too. So thank you for joining me, folks. Keep on listening. Take care.